at the scale of a city like Berlin, at the scale of a country like the UK, at the scale of a region like the EU or the globe. It can get very, very interesting, or even individual scales, households, neighborhoods, families. In our work, we try to look at all of these dimensions. So in a way, our transitions work at Sprue is very socio-technical, and we kind of say all of the above. All of these different things can constitute a type of energy transition in very different contexts. Because of this complexity of factors and variables, however, you see a lot of conceptual devices that have emerged to try to understand transitions processes. So there is an arsenal of conceptual tools. One of the ones that I quite like that I think is interesting, just to give you a taste, comes from Arnulf Grubler and Charlie Wilson, where they have a spatial and a temporal theory of how transitions occur. Temporally, they say that it begins with experimentation, and then it moves to unit scaling, then it moves to industry scaling and standardization, and it eventually reaches market saturation. So that's kind of like the diffusion element of a transition. And then spatially, they talk about how it goes from a core area, like England for Watt's steam engine, and then goes to the periphery after it passes through the rim. And you can see how they map this here for Europe, where an innovation like the phase in of electricity, or the phase out of conventional energy and the phase in of coal power begins in England, goes to the rim of Germany and France, and then goes beyond to the periphery of Spain or Sweden. And of course, now the periphery would be global because society is a lot more globalized than it was in the 1700s. To give you another example, in my own PhD, which Vert very graciously mentioned, I was looking at distributed generation and renewables, but I was using a very particular transitions theory called LTS, Large Technical Systems. This is developed by Thomas Hughes at MIT, the late Thomas Hughes. He passed away a few years ago, and he kind of creates this terminology about how transitions involve systems, socio-technical systems, which he catalogs as seamless webs that fuse together regulatory, economic, cultural, behavioral, technological, and political elements together. And this enables these systems to achieve path dependence. He uses the term momentum. Other people may use the term lock-in. And what's also quite neat about LTS theory is it also has phases, similar in a way to Grubler and Wilson's phases, but also a bit different. So you can see here, Thomas Hughes articulated these phases of invention to style. So a technology is invented, then it expands and adapts, then it creates a system, then it creates resistance, and then it starts to deviate culturally. And what we've done very recently, Thomas Hughes' work famously looked at electricity systems from the 1880s to the 1930s, and then he stopped. So he kind of stopped looking at them just when things got interesting. In other words, before the Great Depression, before World War II, and before electricity systems maybe started to be challenged and reconfigured. So we extended Hughes's phases with these three other ones of reconfiguration, contestation, and stagnation. Some systems can actually stagnate, like coal in the UK, or electric streetcars and trolleys and trams in the United States. And then we mapped out these phases among many socio-technical transitions, not just energy. We're talking electricity, rail, road, shale, nuclear, disaster relief, and flood control, as well as the most interesting one, I think, is stagnation and decline, where we see French railways declining, the trolleys I mentioned, and coal in the UK. That's just two theories about transitions, Grubler and Wilson and Hughes. Shockingly, we interviewed 2 or 3 years ago the theorists themselves. We interviewed people like Frank Hughes and Johann Schott and Sheila Jasanoff, who's coming tomorrow or the next day. And we asked them what theories they thought were very apt at explaining transitions. We interviewed 35 people and got 96 theories. And yes, that's more than 2 theories per person, which we interviewed. And you can see here, they come from a whole variety of disciplines: behavioral science, STS, innovation studies, business, economics, geography, political ecology, development studies, feminist studies. And what we did in a fairly arbitrary way, we created a whole list of theories. So you can see all 96 in the appendix of the article if you want. And this is that they're in order by discipline. So that you can see B, behavioral science. This is why they go first. We tell you the name, who the authors are, and how it applies to transitions, or what we called socio-technical change. That's the full list of 96. And then we created a short list of the most frequently mentioned from the interviews. So this is kind of a way of looking at what is popular, or a way of what our respondents identified as most relevant. And you can see some of them are quite frequent, right? 43% of respondents mention them, 40% mention them. And again, you can see here, the multi-level perspective on transitions and social practice theory came up as the top two. My beautiful LTS shows up as number 5. Grubler and Wilson didn't make it onto this list, although they are in the long list of 96 theories. But again, this really reveals the complexity of the conceptual tools we're trying to use to talk about transitions. And as Leslie was mentioning, some of these deal with discourse, like imaginaries and expectation. Some deal with values and psychology and lifestyles. And some deal with things like structuration theory and how large-scale infrastructures can close off agency of actors. Others deal with actors and agency, like domestication theory. So it really spans the gamut of conceptual diversity as we try to grapple with transitions. Okay, so moving away from that quagmire, I know you're also interested, you're not just interested in theory, also interested in the empirical dynamics. So what does the data say? What do case studies say? What is the evidence base for how we might be able to accelerate transitions? And I'm going to start with the depressing stuff. So you already saw this slide. This is Grubler and Wilson, but I've gone back to it to circle the diffusion speeds for these transitions in Europe. Even though these transitions were in a relatively confined geographic space, Europe, and even though the innovations being phased in, steam power, had so many benefits to what they were replacing, right? Steam power was viewed as like a magical tool that was 20 times more effective than things like wood and 50 times more effective than kind of muscle power or animal power. So even though it was an incredibly powerful innovation, it still took more than a century to diffuse throughout England and more than a century to reach Netherlands, Spain, etc. And the more recent phase-in of electricity also took half a century to 3/4 of a century. The fastest transition there was Portugal, and that still took longer than I've been alive. It took 47 years. So these types of dynamics have convinced people to say things like this quote on the left is the geographer Václav Smil. Energy transitions have been and will be prolonged affairs, especially in places where we have high levels of use, and this makes it impossible to accelerate their progress. Impossible. Not difficult, impossible, even if we're to resort to highly effective intervention. So we have Smil basically saying it is a fool's errand to try to think that we can accelerate transitions in the future because the historical record is so strong at telling us how difficult it is. And to help support Smil's argument, this is the same data plotted two ways. It's basically the big 4 energy transitions around the world that we've seen over the past 300 years, so 1750 to 2025. The upper one is the timeline, and the bottom one is just replotting the data to make it easier to see the years. So as you can see, it took coal 83 years to reach just 5% of total primary energy supply, and it took another 20 or 30 years for it to reach 25%. So almost 120 years for the coal transition to reach 125% from before 1750 to 1873. Oil, despite the fact that it was dense, available, plentiful, and in liquid form, and a very good transport fuel that was used in the world wars, took 80 years. Natural gas, which used to be viewed as so useless it was vented into the air, took 88 years. And nuclear power, despite the fact that it's been around since the Manhattan Project and we had atoms for peace in the 50s, still has not even come close to 25% of total primary energy supply. It's not even 25% of total electricity supply, which is a subset of energy supply. So again, you can start to see why Smil thinks that when you talk about the big transitions, it's not looking so good for how we might accelerate them. And if you take a different focal point, which is what Grubler and Wilson and Nemeth have done here, it looks also bad for diffusion speeds of innovations. So what they've done here is they've plotted some basic devices, steamships, jet aircraft, washing machines, coal-fired power plants across different dimensions. The formative phase is that phase of kind of basic research, R&D, commercialization, all the way up to the point at which it's released into the market. And then the diffusion speeds are, once they've been invented and kind of commercialized, how long does it take for them to diffuse and reach market saturation? So the really depressing thing is to get the true length of diffusion, you have to add them together, the formative phases and the diffusion phases. And again, you can see here, some of these diffusion phases, like for steam, stationary steam engines, is hundreds of years. And some of the diffusion phases on the right for market saturation are also 50 to 60 years, even for things like laundry dryers, 66 years, or passenger cars, 68 years. And here's where it gets even worse. This is just for individual units, or if you want a very STS term, artifacts. It gets even more difficult for systems of systems, where you're talking not about phasing out a gas turbine, but changing an entire electricity network, because it involves the turbine, the power plant, the transmission network, a whole more complicated array. And that makes it magnitudes of order more hard to actually change really deep socio-technical transitions. And then finally, a final way of looking at it isn't how long it takes to phase something new in, it's how long it might take to phase something bad out. And Bruno and Frank have a fascinating case on the flip side of transitions, which is how you phase out of a particular energy resource. They looked at coal in the UK. And again, it's the same thing. The journey for coal, as you can see here, has taken more than 100 years. They've been actively trying to phase down coal since the 1950s, when the UK entered a Clean Air Act, and there was a very dangerous smog in London that killed hundreds of people. And so you can even see since the 50s, a punctuated decline of coal that has not been very, very steep, to the point where even in the year 2000, they were still making about a quarter of the coal they had made in the 1910s, about 50 million tons equivalent. So this also shows you how complex and how long it takes to destabilize and try to phase out of a carbon-intensive fuel. In a country like the UK that takes climate change seriously and that has plentiful other resources, especially gas, nuclear, and renewables, offshore wind. However, it's not all bad. One of the kind of peculiarities in the literature is no one's very clear on what constitutes a major transition. Some people say 5%. Remember, Smill said 25%. Grubler and Wilson, I think, say 50%. Why are these all nice round numbers? Why isn't it 3.562%? Right. So it's very arbitrary where at what point we say a transition has occurred. Most of the research, even that of systems, is still narrowing it to electricity networks or transport networks. So it's kind of an isolated technology or system. And yet, oftentimes, technologies co-evolve or they can mimic each other. And to give you two fascinating examples, early battery electric vehicles in the 1900s and internal combustion cars in the 1900s stole innovation dynamics from each other. And so the conventional car ended up taking about a dozen innovations from EVs at that time: pneumatic engines, pneumatic tires, electric starters, electric motors, and larger boots, which is where you would put the battery. Those all became incorporated into the conventional car. So it might be a mistake to say that the conventional car won over the EV because it incorporated half of the EV's innovations. So it mimicked it, cannibalized it. So it was built into the internal combustion car transition. And the other example, which is graphed here, is coupling. You can see very positive relationships between railway and telegraphs. And this is very intuitive because you were laying down rail networks and using the same labor, and you were also laying down telegraphs right alongside them. Also because railways use telegraphs. But that does mean that the systems were coupled in the same way that oil refineries and roads have been coupled together, because they created a symbiosis. The cheaper oil was, the more available it was, the more demand for cars, the more need for roads. Then the more need for roads there was, the more they needed to increase oil supply. So it really underscores how maybe broadening our focus can reveal more complex transitions dynamics. And then the final big thing is, well, what is your unit of analysis? That big global oil transition that Smill talked about looks like it takes ages. But if you unpack it into discrete transitions of internal combustion engines and steamships and furnaces and refineries, all of those transitions were very accelerated. Some of them are growing at 1,000% per year. So it's like, was it fast or slow? It really depends on where you focus your unit of analysis. So maybe if you look at very particular conditions, fast transitions might be possible. And to show this, we sketched 10 extreme case studies in an article here that shows you 5 fast transitions in energy end-use devices and 5 transitions in national supply. And you can see them here. The 5 ones in end-use devices are energy-efficient lights in Sweden, cook stoves in China, cook stoves in Indonesia. Flex fuel vehicles are vehicles that use ethanol and petrol or gasoline together in Brazil, and air conditioning in the US. And then the 5 national supply transitions were oil and electricity in Kuwait, the Dutch dash for gas, the French nuclear rollout, Danish combined heat and power, and the phase out of coal in Ontario. What I want you to look at, period of transition. These are all transitions that are recent. They're in our lifetimes. They're in the past 50 years. So they're not ancient. Look at the number of years it takes to reach 25% market share. That's the number that Smil was saying was significant. Some of them are 1 year or 2 years. And the longest transition was 16 years. These are fast. And finally, look at the numbers on the right about the number of people that have been affected. I know it's a little bit hard to add them up. It's more than 900 million people have been affected by these transitions. You can see them plotted here by population size in our lifetime. So 1/7 of the global population has already seen some form of rapid energy transition in their lifetime across different markets, Asia, Europe, the US, across different technologies, supply and demand. And we've replicated this very recently in this study, which was just looking at heat, where we looked at rapid and what we call deep transitions. Rapid means they took, again, only a decade or two, and deep means they had to reach lots of households. And we add another 100 million households and 300 million people. And these, again, were things like solar thermal transitions in China or heat pumps in Finland or the natural gas transition in the UK. What these examples seem to point to is that the fundamental drivers of transitions may be changing. My colleagues Florian and Carolyn here have talked about 3 fundamental changes that might accelerate transitions in the future. Historical transitions, they say, have kind of been not accidental or based on discoveries of abundance or based on catastrophes, right? Whereas future transitions can be much more proactively governed. They can even be designed and stimulated by policy. There are new innovation dynamics that are working in very complex ways. Usually it's like ecosystems or global production networks of innovations. And what these can do is accelerate things in ways that even planners don't anticipate. And the example they give is the German feed-in tariff stimulating Chinese innovation in the manufacturing of solar that then greatly accelerated economies of scale, saw declining costs, even to the detriment of Germany, but then pushed solar to go kind of accelerate faster than anyone had predicted at that time. And then finally, they had a lot of faith in the Paris Accords. I'm delighted the United States has just rejoined them. I think the Paris Accords are only Syria and a few other countries have not signed them. And so it is kind of a new global governance norm with our nationally determined contributions that will commit us to a 2-degree world or a 1.5-degree world, hopefully. And Florian also speaks about the importance of phasing out in addition to phasing in. And we have a whole new set of tools like moratoriums and bans. You can ban incandescent light bulbs. You can ban cars, right? Paris and London and other cities around the world are starting to ban conventional cars post 2030 or 2040. Denmark has had a moratorium on coal since 1990. So you can also, use very punitive policy measures alongside those that create incentives. Final parts of this are changes in demand. And so there used to be a debate in fossil fuels about peak oil, M. King Hubbard and the kind of peak oil curve in the 70s, and everyone was concerned about it in the 90s and 2000s. And yet now, a lot of the kind of financial institutes are predicting that we will phase out of oil not because of any peak in supply, but because peak in demand. As that famous quip goes, the Stone Age didn't end for lack of stone, and so the oil age won't end for lack of oil. And this graph comes from a bank, Citi in the US, predicting, look at that title, the end is nigh for global oil demand growth. But it's a flat line, right? They're predicting that, oil production, after you account for just shale gas innovation, will flatten at about 90 million barrels a day. And gas also is starting to penetrate a whole variety of sectors, not just power generation, shipping, industry, trucks, vehicles, et cetera, petrochemicals. So again, changes in demand can shift transition dynamics very quickly. And to illustrate this, I was lucky enough to participate in this event a few years ago, hosted by IBM. And they need to rename it. It's called JUNC, the Global Intelligent Utility Network Coalition. But despite the weird name, look at some of these companies that are involved. It's a consortium of major energy suppliers. Dong, although they've renamed themselves, Ørsted, ERDF, E.ON, TEPCO, Centerpoint, Duke Energy. I think these are electric utilities that are meeting almost 1 billion people, their energy or electricity demand or their gas demand. And what was fascinating is when you see it from their perspective, these are slides from them. The energy transition is not pedantic or academic. It is happening right now, and they are scared, right? They are looking at multiple, they call these threats to their business models. And I really love this. It is an industry slide when rather than call it PVs and storage, they call it grid defection, because that's their perspective. People are defecting from the grid. And you can see as well how they're quite afraid of all of these innovations that are eroding their ability to sell kilowatt hours or units of heat, net metering, solar, storage, EVs, distributed generation. And it's interesting is that you even have some utilities getting up there and saying that they're going to pivot to not even selling energy anymore. Maybe they'll sell bonds or financing. So your utility becomes a bank. Maybe they'll sell analytical software. So they'll become like a McKinsey & Company where they do prediction and other things, or maybe they'll do big data work. Basically, they're so scared of these shifts that they're trying to find other ways to recapture value and avoid what's been called the utility death spiral. One of the other slides they showed was from Houston, Texas, before they had their current energy crisis. And this was in 2017, the 67 apps that were making homes smarter. And you can see how many of them on the right deal with energy and utilities or lighting. And I like to remind people, these innovations would have been almost unimaginable in 1990 because the World Wide Web only comes into effect around 1994, 1995. So imagine an analyst sitting in 1990 thinking, yeah, there's going to be this thing called the internet, and it's going to have smartphones that have these apps that can do connections to digitally devices and the Internet of Things, and will help us better manage energy supply and demand in the home. And you wouldn't have thought about it. And that was just 30 years ago. So it really shows how in just a generation, you have a whole new suite of technologies that have potential at changing dynamics in the home. And what's interesting is we replicated this study. So there were 67 of these on the market in Texas in 2017. We did a study here last year in the UK. And I got to give my research fellow credit. He did expert interviews and he did 37 site visits to stores all across the country, Brighton, Manchester, I think Bristol, London, etc. And we identified 267 of these options available on the market. And look how many of them deal with lighting and energy and utilities, more than 90. And also look at who some of the providers of these companies, of these products are. These are Fortune 500 companies: Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Bosch, Sony, Sharp, Siemens, right? So it is or could be revolutionary at how we use energy in the home. So there's another example of how just one innovation we couldn't have even foreseen 30 years ago is already taking off on the demand side of energy. Two other points I wanted to make before I conclude and open it up for questions. I think that there's also a hidden implication about the complex nature of transitions here for how we do research. And I really wanted to kind of put this out there because I know a lot of people here are professional researchers or early career researchers. And just bear with me. I think it really underscores the need for interdisciplinarity. And I'm going to give you 4 examples. The first one is here. This is from my colleague Felix Kreutzig, who's helping the IPCC's chapter on energy demand. And this is his kind of typology of demand-side solutions for fighting climate change. Basically, what we need as a society is to do all of these things. And he's created this framework about avoiding the things we don't want, shifting modes to be more sustainable, and continuing to innovate and improve technology. So it's called the Avoid, Shift, Improve. But look at the table. It implies if you're going to develop an optimal avoid, shift, improve policy mix, you got to have experts in transport, but also experts in buildings, but also experts in industry and experts in food. So it really starts to show you, if we're going to design this policy mix, I've got to speak as an energy guy to all of these other disciplines, because I don't really know much about food. I don't really know much about industry. And so it requires interdisciplinarity across these different dimensions. Second example. I've been talking a lot about global transitions in the north, but transitions in the global south are also important. And you may have noticed that 2 of those transitions that I mentioned that were the most rapid were cook stoves in Indonesia and China. And that's because one of the most dangerous things women can still do today is cook in the home. It's not go out late at night or take an unsafe job. And indoor air pollution from cook stoves kills 4 million people a year, more than malaria or tuberculosis or HIV/AIDS. It's 11 deaths per minute. It's 11 deaths in the minute it's taking me to talk about this slide. And 80% of those deaths are in women and children under the age of 5. So tackling this type of challenge requires interdisciplinarity among these dimensions. This is from the World Health Organization. We need the engineers and the fuel scientists to talk about how we change combustion and sources of pollution, to work then with the architects and the sociologists about how we change the living environment, to then also work with psychologists and social scientists and anthropologists about how we change behavior. And only by doing all 3 things at once, changing pollution, changing the environment, changing behavior, can we actually start to tackle this very serious issue to get a better understanding about gender norms and cultural dynamics that trap women and children into literally dying based on how they use energy. It's the second example. Third example comes from my colleague, Frank Heels. I mentioned earlier, he has his multi-level perspective, which is considered one of the most powerful tools right now to understand transitions, talks about niches and regimes and the landscape. And this is the simplified diagram of transitions. You should have seen the complex one. But look at the left. So what Frank's kind of telling us is, if we're going to understand the temporal and spatial nature of transitions, we have to have people who understand the technologies and the business models. So that's going to be STS, innovation studies, business studies, and behaviors, psychology. We have to have experts who know about industry, maybe engineers, and culture, maybe communication studies and discourse analysis, and policy and science, that's political science. And then we also need to have people who understand broader trends, economics and demography. So again, if you're going to understand the complexity of the transition in its whole, you need about 20 disciplines, all working together that specialize in these different aspects of transitions dynamics. And then the final example is justice, which I know is a very important theme here at the conference. And this theme, what we've done very recently in the Innopaths project is we did original research on 4 European transitions, 4 transitions that you've probably heard of and that everyone talks about: nuclear power in France, solar energy in Germany, battery electric vehicles in Norway, and that's a smart meter and an in-home display in Great Britain. They have them for electricity and natural gas. And we mapped out the injustices from those transitions using a mix of interviews, focus groups, and looking at internet forums. And what was quite shocking is all of these injustices in red, which were identified by our respondents, are outside of Europe. So like the European transitions have impacts that cascade to affect tar sands in Canada and shale gas exports in the US, and that's lithium mines in South America and cobalt mines in the Congo and e-waste flows to Ghana and coal exports and LNG trade from Australia and low-wage manufacturing in China and Gazprom's profits in Russia. And it goes on and on and on. The exportation of dirty cars that leave Norway because the old conventional cars don't just disappear, they go somewhere else, like Poland or Estonia. So it really shows troublingly the multi-scalar nature of injustice. And I don't know the answer to the question, is it fair that this young cobalt miner who is mining cobalt for energy storage and batteries for EVs and even some materials for solar and wind, that they're so poor, they don't even mine with a shovel or with shoes. He's taking his shoes off, or with structural support or ventilation or PPE. They will spend 8 to 10 days in the dark mining with their hands to extract cobalt. And that cobalt is then used for devices that we need to fight energy poverty in Europe, heat pumps and solar and storage. That is a very tricky ethical question. Is it okay that one group of poor people suffer so another group of poor people benefit? But I do know that the group that's probably best equipped to answer that question are the philosophers, the legal studies scholars, and the arts and humanities who deal with justice theory. And so I think this also underscores the need to kind of couple arts and humanities thinking with social science thinking, with engineering thinking, especially when we see that these low carbon transitions keep hurting the same groups independent of the transition. So whether you're talking about solar in Germany or EVs in Norway, they always tend to hurt the same vulnerable groups. They always tend to lead to unemployment for certain areas, and they always tend to produce externalities, right? So it's like independent of the transition, the poor and the disabled always tend to be dispossessed. Aha, and you're right. I did promise to mention COVID-19. This is the final part of the talk very quickly, is just to kind of put it into context of the pandemic as well. So we did a special issue of the journal that I edit, Energy Research and Social Science. You can click it here. It's got 16 articles from 14 disciplines, and they're organized roughly into these 4 topics. What are the energy and climate impacts of the pandemic? What are its impact on sustainability practices? What are its connections with justice? And what are its connections with research practice? Very eerily, a structure that's close to my own talk now, which talks about conceptualizing transitions and empirical evidence and kind of justice dynamics. And you can see what we find in the special issue, and this is the introduction that summarizes the special issue. It is a dual impact. There are some things that are positive, i.e. we've all traveled a lot less, and some things that are negative, i.e. we're going to probably have huge rebounds once the pandemic is over. And it's disrupted financing patterns for things like off-grid solar, or it's collapsed solar PV markets, because nobody wants to go and install solar in a house when you have a pandemic and have to socially distance. So I think I was seeing Bloomberg Finance's projections that the solar market in the US has contracted by 90%. 90%. For the past year. So that really underscores the complexity of how it's having these impacts on energy and climate. Same with transitions. You see an uptake in some transitions like EVs, because obviously those are still like private automobiles that you can drive by yourself. And you see other things like the collapse of ride sharing, because who wants to ride share when the person you're sharing a car with could have the disease? And you see very interesting connections with justice, right? You see, on the one hand, 50 countries around the world implementing very strong emergency protection measures, which are helping give targeted assistance to vulnerable groups. At the same time, you see kind of the undermining of energy access programs around the world, or very strategically industry groups using the pandemic to expedite fossil fuel siting or to use it as an excuse to waive environmental standards. And finally, you have very interesting impacts on research. On the one hand, we're all becoming much more familiar with digital interaction. Look at this. On the other hand, this type of digital interaction is exposing us to things like privacy concerns, and within my energy group, we've been Zoom bombed, I think, 3 times. And one time we even had someone expose themselves in the middle of a seminar to students, right? So this also underscores the kind of dualistic nature of there are pros and cons. I think the other thing that is quite interesting is how we've responded to the pandemic fits a template. And it fits a kind of neat template that I've mapped out here, right? If you were to take how we've responded to the pandemic as a recipe, the recipe has these ingredients. We've changed routines and practices, right? Social distancing, wearing masks, quarantining. We've bolstered health infrastructure. We've enhanced monitoring. We've accelerated financing. We've tried to back our interventions by sound scientific advice. We've tried to stimulate innovation. We've used a variety of institutions to convey information, right? i.e., medical professionals in the CDC, but also churches and also superstars and a whole variety of different channels of communication. And we've tried to protect the vulnerable. And I think that this kind of coronavirus effect could also paint the way here if you were to translate it to energy and climate, right? Maybe there's something there. If we were to do these things similar to how we've done the pandemic, focusing and giving instructions and reducing carbon footprints, bolstering infrastructure, enhancing capacity, financing, monitoring innovation, protecting the vulnerable, and all that, this could actually see very rapid progress made on energy and climate. So there's a hidden recipe, I guess, within our coronavirus responses. However, there's also a warning, because those of you know, the coronavirus response has not been rainbows and roses for everyone. So as much as we see progress there, we also see 7 negative things that also plague energy and climate transitions, right? People not paid attention to warnings about a crisis, delayed responses, nationalism at the expense of the public good. I'm thinking here of the US withdrawing funding for the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. Politics overshadowing social welfare, marginalized populations getting the worst impacts, conspiracy theories. Remember the whole theory about 5G spreading coronavirus, and fatigue of mitigation measures. We're in our 3rd lockdown here in the UK because people get tired of being locked down and they go out and violate the rules. Then we have to have strong-handed interventions again. So I think that this also shows you the barriers that will exist as we try to move forward on any science policy-based recommendations. Okay, to conclude, bringing it back together to remind you from the first parts of the talk, definitions abound when you talk about transitions, and I think whether it is fast or slow will always depend on its unit of analysis and how it is defined. So whenever anyone is making claims of transitions, always check the C assumptions, thresholds. Are they thinking about coupling? What is their scale, etc.? We have no shortage of conceptual tools that grapple with transitions, 96 of them. But in some ways, this is a quagmire or a minefield. On the one hand, maybe it implies that none of those 96 have gotten it right. We don't have a unified theory. And so they're all wrong. Or maybe it means instead, no. If we can have 100 different ways of viewing a painting, or 100 ways of reacting to a film, or 100 ways of thinking about fashion, well, maybe it's okay that we have 100 different ways to view transitions, right? Maybe this reflects the breadth and diversity of scholarship, and that's a good thing. It should be celebrated rather than kind of criticized. My own take is that all of the 96 approaches are useful, but they're incomplete because each of them reveals something in its lens that's in focus, but it also means that something is out of focus. So it's kind of fit for purpose. Each one might be useful in a particular context for a particular research question. And if you like the frequency analysis we did, it does imply the multi-level perspective and social practice theory are the most popular transitions approaches. And I can see now as researchers that may tell you to use them because everyone knows what they are and there's a strong reviewer pool and there's less confusion. Or I can see you thinking, I'm not going to use them because I don't want to use what everyone else is using. I want to use something fresh and new. So I'm going to avoid using social practice theory and the MLP. So I can see both sides of that debate. Remember my point as well about transitions requiring interdisciplinarity. I think this is very true, whether it's by sector, right, transport and food and electricity, or by training, i.e. fuel science, buildings, and gender, or things like dimension, this is the MLP, culture, industry, markets, user, discourse, or whether it's things like including justice and the arts and humanities and ethics. The causes of transitions are quite complex. I didn't really get into these, but to talk for the 10 fast transitions that we identified in the one article, causes are as diverse as the world wars. World War II is what created Charles de Gaulle to try to create a radiant France after German occupation. And so he decided to embark on nuclear power to help reclaim French greatness. Kuwait, we were able to tap into oil and gas in Kuwait because World War II ended and there was fighting on those oil fields. And so once hostilities ceased, there was an era of peace and stability that enabled us to construct rapidly infrastructure in the Middle East. The main driver behind the Chinese cook stoves program was a horrible famine. And the oil crises of the 70s had a direct relationship on Denmark's combined heat and power program and Brazil's pro-alcohol program, which was a precursor to their flex fuel vehicles. And some transitions are just demand. No one planned for air conditioning to take off, other than, I suppose, William Carrier, who invented the wall-mounted air conditioner, right? But that was not a transition steered by a crisis or by policy. It just kind of happened. Future transitions, though, I think, can have different causes. And let's hope we don't need world wars, famines, and global crises to stimulate future transitions. But they can be driven by active governance rather than reactive governance. They might be driven by scarcity rather than abundance. And they might be stimulated by changes in demand, like pandemics, rather than changes in supply. So what I think, bringing it all back together to people like Smill and Grubler and Wilson, is that the past is really instructive, but it does not necessarily have to be predictive at where we go in the future with our transitions. And with that, I'm very happy to open it up for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Benjamin. That was a really, it was a big picture of interdisciplinary energy research. And as is expected, we have a lot of questions. Some are very fundamental. And I would start, and then we changed, Leslie and me, we will change with questioning. And I would start with two questions from the Q&A board. The first one is, what do you think about this, the role of costs? For example, the role of costs in pushing the mobility from combustion internal combustion to e-mobility. You need new infrastructure and so on. The role of costs is the first question, and the other question is, what is the role of social movements in acceleration of energy innovations? For example, we have this tradition of anti-nuclear protests in Germany. One of the sources of I would say the sources of the research in solar energy was the protest against nuclear energy. For example, in Real, in the Black Forest, there was in the 70s already a big social movement. And where do you put the role of social movements in your structure of analysis? This is the question in the beginning.
Great question. So costs are obviously very important. And a lot of the reason that many of the innovations transitions occurred is that the innovations had cost benefits compared to what they were replacing. We've done some work. I mean, it's hard to quantify costs. I think too much work tries to reduce these transitions to only costs or to techno-economic factors. It's about performance and cost. And some of the frameworks that we talk about that we've used, like cost-benefit analysis, do limit it to those things. But there are other frameworks that say that it is about costs, yes, but also things like practices. So, which are hard to monetize, like comfort or luxury or guilt. We found that one of the biggest reasons people like driving an EV is because they feel less guilty. How do you monetize that? How much is it worth feeling less guilty? That's an emotion that's very hard to quantify into willingness to pay. And we've done other studies that use what are called choice experiments, where we give people criteria that they can choose and factor in. Like when they're choosing an EV, maybe you want it to be cheap, but you also want the range to be good. So how do they go with that tension? And from that work, we've kind of found that costs matter about 50% of the way. So it's like a very, very important factor, and it's very significant, but it's only half of what's causing the kind of decisions to be made. There are other factors as well, like familiarity and risk and other attributes, saving the environment, that also matter. So I think this tells me as cost is a significant factor. It's a necessary factor, but it might be insufficient on its own to catalyze a transition. There could be other factors as well, like security or geopolitics or culture, that play a very strong role. Social movements don't really come into our analysis because, I mean, a lot of the frameworks that we use, like the multi-level perspective, it talks about actors, but the actors can be a movement or an industry group or a government or users. So I think that it does kind of conflate them together. I think that populism and social movements are a very important factor in maybe not energy transitions, but in social transitions. I have a colleague at Sprue called Andy Sterling that some of you may know of, and he critiques, if he sees this presentation, he's like, Benjamin, where are the social movements? All progressive change has never come from science and technology. All the most important things that we can talk about recently, abolition of slavery, civil rights movement, even things like anti-whaling efforts have been social movements. And so for him, they're the huge catalysts of change. And governments reacting to them is one of the most important kind of facets of an important transition. So I do think that's a valid point. And I think that it's a shame that our work hasn't focused more on transitions through the lens of social movements, because they're very important.
Thanks, Benjamin. I'm receiving many thanks from all the participants. I would like to give them to you. So thank you very much for this very, very inspiring talk. I would also like to ask you two questions from the participants. One is from Henrike Rau. She would like to know, don't you think that COVID-19 and climate change are very different or fundamentally different crises, in fact, because of the temporal dimension? One is like a rapidly emerging pandemic versus the slow onset of climate change. And how does that affect the transferability of solutions? And the second question I would like to add to this is by Timo Krüger. And he asks, maybe critically, whether we can really rely on innovative technologies to combat climate change. And don't we rather need a massive reduction of energy demand, which is only possible within a degrowth scenario? So basically, isn't this a fundamentally political challenge?
Yeah, no, geez, tough questions, Leslie. So to the first, yeah, there are some attributes of the coronavirus pandemic that I think are applicable to climate, like how we frame our messages and how we focus on both behavior and innovation together, and how we proliferate new practices. Like we all started socially distancing and wearing masks very quickly, right? That I think will last if we need to again, because we've had these lockdowns that go over and over again. But there are other elements of COVID that are not transferable. It's a health issue. People tend to take health much more seriously than the environment. It's much more immediate. And you fall sick with COVID, you get it like in 2 weeks' time. Whereas climate change could have impacts in 100 years' time. So you're right, there is a temporal mismatch, and there are many elements of COVID that are distinct from climate action, even though I think we can learn from it. We can't just copy it over entirely. Question about degrowth, I agree completely. And that is, when I give some of the talks about injustices, some people say, but that's just capitalism. That's just because our entire global civilization is on overshoot and are hyper consuming, and that we have these huge disparities in equity and in wealth. And so what we really need is anti-capitalist movements, independent of energy. We could solve it all if we just abolish capitalism. And I don't know, I think, we have this debate very intently at Sprue because we do have people that are advocating for degrowth, that we scale back demand, we contract and converge, so that our high industrialized lifestyles come down in resource intensity, just while the developing world catches up. And we meet somewhere in the middle where we're eating half as much meat and we're flying maybe never or once a year. So we've changed our lifestyles. But there's another part of Sprue that is all about innovation and how much better technologies have gotten. LED lights are like 1,000 times more efficient than incandescent lights. And they've just come in the past 30 years. And a combined cycle gas turbine now has a thermal efficiency of close to 90%, whereas in the 1930s it was 30%. So we've tripled the efficiency of these things, right? And I've heard other great things like material science and other wind turbines, right? The interconnected capacity factor of a wind farm is now close to 50%, where it was like 10% just a few decades ago. So there's something to be said for these innovations. And I think that's the point, is we need to make sure that we harness those innovations so that they don't create rebounds in waste and increases in consumption. And we use them only to help reduce energy demand. And the other area in which it's quite neat, which is connected to growth, is patents and ownership. Who owns these innovations? Because oftentimes it's not communities. It's these big Fortune 500 companies like Jeff Bezos that's just adding another zero to his profit margin. And so I also think there's a case for changing the ownership structure of energy, make it more cooperative, as well as issues of labor and protecting workers. So I think that's what a just transition gets into. So I certainly think that degrowth principles and capitalism certainly need examined critically to see how they can be put into the discussion about transitions.
Thank you.
Leslie, before we go, I did make a poll. I'll put it out.
I forgot.
Two questions for people. You can
Please.
just click and we can talk about it later. First one is, I was just kind of curious if you think that the COVID pandemic will improve.
So please, everybody, participate in the poll. And Benjamin, you will be the only one who can see the results.
Okay. And then the other one was this question: are you convinced that the transitions will be fast or slow? Those are the only two I made for now. And I can wait for people to do it. We can talk about the results later, maybe.
I can't see it anymore, though, Benjamin. You clicked it away. No, yeah. And you have to keep it open so people can answer.
That's what I didn't do. Yep.
Okay.
And I can only do one poll at a time. That's the other thing I've learned.
So I think that they need a bit of time, so I can give
a question.
Yeah, I can summarize 2 or 3 questions more. One is from Patrick Scherhofer, and he asked, what do you think is the role of energy communities, which are one of the goals of the EU New Green Deal and the energy policy of the European Commission? What do you think? What is the role and the future role of energy communities? And the other question is from Sophie Buchel. She asked, which conditions and governance approaches are common among fast and deep transitions, and what can we learn from them?
Great question. So on communities, I think communities are a really important actor. I think it's quite telling that in some of the transitions we looked at, Germany and Denmark, you have strong community involvement. And yet in others, like the air conditioning one in the US, you have no community involvement. It was just people buying stuff, for a private home. I think it's important sometimes to connotate communities and cities as closely aligned. And there's been really good work that talks about how the future of transitions, the future of energy, the future of humanity is going to be about cities. And I've seen some work even suggest that post-2050, it will be city-states, city authorities like London or Paris that have much more authority and roles, and they're more important drivers in transitions, especially since like 80% of us live in cities anyway. So I do think that that makes energy more local, makes it more community-based. So I certainly think that it is maybe one of the most important factors to be examined looking in the future. Yeah, and what was the second question? I was so focused on the first one, Bert. Or have you forgotten as well?
No, I didn't forget. There was a question of which approaches are from deep and fast innovations.
Gotcha. So there are a lot of different governance approaches that you can use. The one that I like is called polycentrism. And this is from Elinor Ostrom, and it's about kind of involving multiple actors at different scales, the bottom up and the top down. So it's about kind of heterogeneity of actors at different scales, but she also creates these conditions. She's got these 7 conditions for how humanity or how institutions or how people govern collective action dilemmas. And I think those conditions are really good. They hold. We've looked at them in the heat transitions paper that we did, and we also looked at them in a subset of the fast transitions. We took a subsample of the German transition, the Danish transition, the Chinese transition for cook stoves, and the Brazilian transition for vehicles. And we found that her polycentrism framework has a very high degree of explanatory power at explaining those transitions. And it's different things like trust. It's things like proportional distribution of costs and benefits. So it's getting to like equity and fairness. It's things like adaptive management, so that people involved in that kind of problem will adapt and learn. It's things like sharing of information and open knowledge. So I think these are kind of really strong principles that help paint the way. And they've been proven not just for energy, things like water management and forestry management and other ways of managing the commons, I think hold true as well. So I would start there, because I think it's a very powerful framework that for me was very revealing about governance.
Okay, we have another long question here. I I think I'm gonna share this question because it's so long. Let me see if I can do that. No, I can't. Okay, this person, Victoria Brendler, asks, coming from political science, she is interested in, wait, I need to navigate these questions. Political preferences play a major role in energy transition, and like how she thinks that national regulatory styles and also political preferences play a major role in energy transitions, and whether or not and how countries shift. And she asked, could you perhaps comment on the politics of it all? So you say this aspect is just one of, would you say that this aspect is just one of those 96 theories, or is there perhaps something that should always be included in work on energy transitions or on interdisciplinary work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in our list of 96 theories, there were some political theories. There were those like Bob Cohane and his regime complexes, and there were others that were talking about, the three kind of classic political science approaches are constructivism, liberalism, and realism, or now neorealism. So those are kind of discussed. Also depends on politics at what scale. Like local politics is very different than geopolitics.
Yeah.
But I think politics is really important. And what's neat about some of the most recent theories like the MLP are they do include politics, right? Politics is one of those factors that's shaping the landscape. And politics is one of the disciplines that needs to be engaged with to understand transitions processes. To get more specifically into things like national styles of innovation, or national regulatory styles, or there's another term called varieties of capitalism. I also think that they matter, but I think they're one of many factors. And so we did some work quite earlier on the politics of nuclear power. And we found that, again, this whole STEP framework, science and technology, environment, politics, and social behavior, all played a role in nuclear power. So politics is there, but it's one of many dimensions. And we even included national regulatory styles and regimes, but it's just one of many. I will refer the final part as you can read the handbook of International Political Economy of Energy. It's brilliant. Thijs van de Graaf put it together. It's published by Palgrave. And then Thijs also has a book that he did with me called Global Energy Politics, which is quite neat. Both of them engage with a lot of the literatures of politics and governance. I'll put them in the chat. But
please.
Especially the handbook. The handbook is like 60 chapters from so many people contributed. And I think that would be an excellent starting point.
And then there's another question regarding to the interdisciplinary approach of energy research, and from Silvio Bucco, and he asks, do you see new forms of organizing interdisciplinary research on energy transitions which may underuse or not in use in the moment? For example, we call real labor, real life experiments or something like that. You didn't mention that.
Yeah, and so it's a good question. And there are other areas too, like action research is another method that you can use, or other different frames. Like I didn't talk about a lot of anti-racist work or feminist work, which can also, or neo-Marxist work. So I think there are both different frames and modes of how we do research. There is a whole school of transdisciplinary research for how you engage non-academic partners in the research process, which I think can be important. It gets quite complex though, because the more actors you involve in research, the more expensive it can get, the more time consuming it gets. And, if we're in the middle of having to decarbonize within the next 2 years, can we wait to do a 5-year research process that patiently involves everyone in a project and all of that? There are other things like consensus committees and citizens assemblies, which are very interesting. I was really lucky to serve as the advisory board on the UK's Climate Assembly, which was a citizens group. But again, that process took 2 years, and I think they're only releasing their reports now. So this is tricky because you need to balance inclusion and novelty in design with speed and effectiveness. And if you buy the IEA's projections that we've only got a few more years before we blow through our carbon budget, that really underscores a climate emergency. At the same time, the seriousness of the emergency means we don't want to do the wrong thing. So there's really this tension between kind of careful reflexivity and rapid action.
Here's a question by Torben Stürmann, referring to your topic about accelerating energy transitions. He asks, how fast should they actually be, these transformation processes? Especially with regard to questions of energy justice, or of what we might lose if we go too fast, and how can we find like the right speed for transformation?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, this is what's so beautiful or complex about the question, is because if it's climate first, that gives you a whole set of options. That's just about getting carbon out of the air and maybe even deploy net zero technologies like direct air capture and BECCS, and even maybe some solar radiation management. But those could be disastrous for indigenous groups. They could be disastrous for farmers because they're taking up a lot of land, and they could consolidate technology among the incumbents. So there are anti-trends with democracy and community sustainability. And if you put people first, then it's about things like jobs, maybe it's local resilience, maybe it's using local resources, which means fossil fuels come back in. Because, you know, communities in India, if they're near coal reserves, that's what they've got. And if people in Wyoming and South Africa have been trained in coal mining, that's the skills they have. So I think it really underscores having to balance these objectives in very particular ways. I think that probably means we come back to Vert's notion of communities, that each community maybe decides how they steer their transition in certain ways based on those goals and how they play out. And I also think it means that you know, maybe sometimes we slow down certain transitions if it looks like they're having negative impacts on groups. And the final thing is, I don't think that the future transitions will be that fast. I don't think I see them happening in like 2 years or 5 years. I think a lot of the evidence suggests 2030, 2040. So we've got another 10 to 15 years as we kind of shape these transitions. Notice though as well, if you buy that argument that the main transitions have to happen in 15 years, that already rules out certain options. Things like fusion, things like small modular reactors, things like fourth generation biofuel, algal fuel, things like hydrogen. It's like maybe too late. Like what we need to do instead is energy efficiency, demand side management, wind, solar, biogas, et cetera. So it already starts to kind of really show you the particular options we have to ramp up, and maybe the options we have to write off if we want a transition to happen in 10 years. So that's the other part, is does the rapidity of a transition foreclose particular options that are too late, too long away?
There's another question by Chad Baum, and regarding this this disaster in Texas in these days. And the question is, what do you think regarding the interplay between such crisis, manifest crisis, and the diffusion of transition? There are political struggle nowadays that the renewables may be responsible for this disaster. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, I mean, the Texas crisis, the only lesson to me that the Texas crisis reveals is that climate change is creating unanticipated stresses on energy systems. And so I think that's something we can all, and climate change will affect renewables, it'll affect fossil fuels, it'll affect all of these things, especially sea level rise and changes in temperature and all that are affecting every aspect of lives. I really like the US Department of Defense because they called climate change a threat multiplier. What it does is it takes every existing threat you can think of, military, humanitarian, et cetera, and it multiplies it, insecurity, refugee flows, et cetera. So I think that will happen. The very particular notion of the Texas crisis had very little to do with wind energy. I think there have been good studies that have already, good analyses, like wind energy's role in the Texas crisis was less than 1%. It was really gas. You had natural gas power plants that were freezing, so that it simply stopped working, and then you had other sources of natural gas fuel, which couldn't get fuel to the plants that were operating. And the final unique thing about the Texas crisis is it's very unique because Texas operates its own grid. It's not interconnected very strongly with the rest of the US. This is the Texan way, but they have this thing called ERCOT, which also means like FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has been talking to Texas about interconnecting for like 30 years. So I think this is also very peculiar. It only could have happened in Texas. And it also didn't happen in all the states around Texas because they're interconnected with the rest of the US. So I think this also underscores at a grid level interconnection and overriding local politics, because Texas kind of prided itself on having its own grid. That's how we do it down here. And it kind of showed them that, well, that's not very sound when you have unanticipated spikes in weather. So I think the lesson is more about interconnection and climate change, and not wind turbines are bad and can't work in cold environments.
I have another question here that goes back to the social justice dimension. It's by Jewel Lord Tolentino Nem. And he asks, to what extent does the balance of responsibility lie between developed and developing countries?
Yeah, I like the UN. FCCC had some good terminology. They've moved away from it a bit, but it was common but differentiated responsibility. The notion there, I mentioned it a little bit in my talk. It was this notion of contraction and convergence. And that's kind of high emitting societies like Germany and the US need to contract emissions. And we need to give space for developing societies like China and India or others, sub-Saharan Africa, to increase emissions. And we converge in the middle. So, and we also transfer a lot of technology to them so they can use the technologies of climate mitigation or adaptation. And I like that because it implies that we do all have a responsibility, but it's not equal. And there's a historical responsibility that high emitting countries like my own America or the UAE or Germany have. It should be on us first because we've polluted the atmosphere. Like 95% of emissions are rich countries. Only 5% of emissions are the developing world. And it isn't fair. They have the right to develop just as much as we did 50 to 70 years ago. And so I think that that responsibility does need to be differentiated, and it's on us first to do things like change our lifestyles and cut our emissions as much as we can. That responsibility, though, Leslie, isn't as hard as it may seem. We did a really neat study looking at 4 high-income European countries as part of the HOPE project. HOPE is Household Preferences for Energy. And it was in Germany, Norway, France, and Sweden. And we found that households could cut their carbon footprints in half, with relatively small changes to their lifestyles without giving up anything big. This is things like taking 1 less vacation per year, eating 1 less thing per meat per year, maybe taking the bus a little bit more, right? So we're not giving up. We're not like living in the cold with warm beer and no showers. So I think that's inspiring. So we can really shape our footprints and take responsibility with at least half of our emissions. The downside is that the other half you have to force. And so people won't do it. So that also implies responsibility shifts to the government or other actors to force, coerce, or if you want a polite term, incentivize households to make the other emissions cuts. So I'll put the study, which is called It Starts at Home, I'll put it into the comments as well.
And
but
there's also imbalances, of course, within these countries, and they're wealthier and more capable of going on vacation, people in these countries. But before we come to a close, Benjamin, would you like to share with us the results of your polls?
Yes. So very interesting.
But can you share them on the screen, maybe?
Can I?
I think that should be possible.
Let's see.
If you've kept them open all along, then you should be able to.
I have. Let me
click on share results or something like that.
It's weird. It's not letting me share the screen when I have the box open for the polls. Let me just tell you.
Okay.
So, will the COVID pandemic improve sustainability trends or not? We have a resounding yes. 63.5% said it will improve sustainability. Only 36.5% said it would worsen sustainability. So it's a almost 2/3 to 1/3 break. So people seem more optimistic about the COVID pandemic. And then for the one about fast or slow, we're also optimistic. We had 64% of people say they think that the future transitions will be fast, and 36% of people said that they will be slow. So you've got a bunch of optimists within the audience. That's refreshing.
It is. Didn't you have a third?
I didn't. No, I think I just gave the same one twice.
Okay. So, Vert, do you have another question?
No. Oh, there are some questions we're already.
Well, I have one more here. It's it's about the scholarship and about research on energy transitions. You mentioned interdisciplinarity. It's by Joni Karjalainen. Do you feel happy with the present balance of academic contributions? Or do you feel some scientific fields or disciplines might be underrepresented? And would you like to see them even more in the debate?
Yeah, great question. And we do have an answer to this. So the first one is we did a study last year on climate funding, and we looked at $1.3 trillion of funding over a 70-year period. And we found, first of all, that only 0.12% of funding was spent on climate change social science. So if the problem of climate change is a social problem, we are funding it across all of those research projects less than 0.5% of the time. So we obviously need to rapidly ramp up funding for climate research commensurate to the challenge. The other thing that we found is if you look at a subsample of that data, so 1990 to 2018, so pretty recently, the natural and technical sciences received 770% more funding than the social sciences. So there's also a 770 to 1 bias, right? That favors technical, and that's not even economics. This is technical, physics, chemistry, etc. So we do seem to be trapped into this notion of we can build better technology to solve the climate crisis. And that's how we fund those aspects. And I think that's very problematic. So if I could massively control how we would change funding, I would firstly triple, quadruple the amount we spend on climate change overall. I mean, we shouldn't be spending more on things like dog food research, which is actually close to even. We spend almost as much on veterinary science and like how to research better food and protein for animals and pets than we spend on climate change. I think I've also seen that the energy industry spends less R&D on new energy innovations than the ice cream industry spends on innovating flavors. So it also kind of shows you what are we doing as a society that we're spending more on dog food and ice cream. So increase the amount on climate change, and then at least rebalance it. It's whenever you point out these asymmetries in funding and you say, oh, the natural and physical sciences got 700% more, what's the right balance? Is it 50-50? I don't know that, right? Who knows the right balance, some magic number, but I would be delighted if it was 33% to 66%. And maybe we should start by saying 50-50. Half of the research is on technology and innovation, and half is on all these other things like policy and users and behavior and politics and power and governance and gender. And so I would also at least reprioritize funding patterns to privilege the social sciences because we've been marginalized for way too long compared to these other disciplines. And then the final thing I would say, let's not forget the arts and humanities, which are often marginalized by the social scientists, right? It's like we have this hierarchy of like physical sciences, social sciences, arts and humanities. And I think, there's so much to learn from history, and there's so much to learn from ethics, and there's so much to learn from communication studies and theater and art, new ways of communicating messages. Maybe if we had a clever song, we would help fight climate change. Maybe we need a new religion rooted in climate change and how we fight it. So I think that let's not marginalize those areas of inquiry either. And so we have to reprivilege the arts and humanities alongside the social sciences, in my view.
I think that's a great last statement for a social scientific energy conference. I thank you so much, Benjamin, for your talk. I thank you all for your questions and for the discussion that we have had. And now we go into a 10-minute break before we meet again in our sessions. And Benjamin, we are looking forward to meeting you again on Wednesday.
See you Wednesday. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
People are leaving the room. I will wait another minute before I kick everyone to the lobby.